Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life. Please take a moment to like and subscribe. It really helps.
All right, let's dive right in. We're talking about the assassination of JFK. It's one of those events that even decades later, even after all the declassified files and investigations, so many people still have really basic questions.
It's true. You would think after all this time we'd have a clearer picture, but it seems like the more we learn, the more questions we have, and that's what we're going to tackle today.
Exactly. So if you're listening, you probably feel that way too. You want to know what we've actually learned, but also, and this is important, what's still unclear, what still feels unresolved.
And that's the focus of this deep dive. We're going straight to the source, the House hearing on JFK files declassification, and looking at what the experts themselves say about what we know now and what we still don't know.
Right. So we've got Oliver Stone, James Eugenio, Jefferson Morley, John Davidson. These are people who've spent years, some of them decades, digging into this case. And we're going to distill their key takeaways, especially those lingering questions. We want to give you a clear sense of what still puzzles the people who know this case inside and out.
And maybe even more importantly, we'll try to figure out why those questions are still so difficult to answer. So let's start with a question that always comes up. The official narrative, the lone gunman theory, is there really that much doubt about it?
Well, James Eugenio mentioned something pretty striking. He said that 65% of the public just doesn't buy it.
That's a huge number, and it tells you that even after all these years, a majority of people just don't believe the official explanation.
Yeah, and Eugenio went even further. He said over 90% believe something major, something monumental happened after the assassination that shaped things.
Right, like there's a cover-up or some kind of hidden truth. That kind of belief leads to a lot of cynicism, a lack of trust in official narratives.
Yeah.
And, even Chairwoman Luna during the hearing talked about this.
What did she say?
She said, and I'm quoting here, "There are sincere concerns and discrepancies regarding the Warren Commission pushing forward a narrative without all the facts."
So even within the government, there are people acknowledging that the Warren Commission might not have had the full story.
Yeah, and even more concerning, she talked about the Warren Commission omitting evidence.
Okay, so right off the bat, we're seeing that the official explanation isn't satisfying a lot of people, both the public and even some officials. Now, let's get into some of the specific areas where those doubts come from. Jefferson Morley really zeroed in on the CIA.
He did, and his testimony is pretty disturbing. He called the newly declassified JFK files, quote, disturbing new revelations about what the CIA knew about Oswald before the assassination.
And he didn't just make general accusations, he named names, right?
Absolutely. He named 3 high-ranking CIA officers who he believes lied under oath.
Okay, wow. Who were they?
Richard Helms, James Angleton, and George Joanides.
Those are some big names in the intelligence world, so what were their alleged lies about?
Well, take Richard Helms. He was the director of Central Intelligence. He told the Warren Commission that the CIA only had minimal information about Oswald before the assassination.
Minimal information, okay.
But Morley points to a 198-page file on Oswald that the CIA had before the assassination.
So minimal doesn't really seem accurate.
Exactly. Then there's James Angleton, the head of counterintelligence. He denied that the CIA was monitoring Oswald's mail when he was living in the Soviet Union.
Interesting.
But Morley says newly declassified documents show that they were, in fact, watching Oswald's mail very closely.
That's a pretty big contradiction. And what about Joanides?
He was involved in the AMSPL program.
Remind me, what was AMSPL again?
It was a CIA program that produced anti-Castro propaganda.
Right.
Well, Morley claims Joanides deliberately obstructed Congress by preventing them from investigating any connections between Oswald and the AMSPL program. He basically shut down any inquiries into that.
So Morley's saying there was a deliberate effort to hide information about Oswald's potential ties to this anti-Castro operation.
Yeah.
And he was pretty strong in his condemnation, right? He called these actions incriminating.
Yeah, he went so far as to suggest that these weren't just mistakes or oversights. He said it points to guilty knowledge and criminal culpability.
So if we're trying to understand what we still don't know, what Morley's suggesting is that we still don't know the full extent of the CIA's involvement with Oswald. He has some specific demands, right?
Yes, he wants 2 things. First, he wants the full release of George Joanides' personnel file.
Which presumably would shed more light on his role in all of this.
Exactly. And second, he wants the CIA to explain publicly why these 3 men, Helms, Angleton, and Joanides, allegedly lied to investigators. He sees that as a fundamental issue of accountability.
Okay, so Morley's raising some really serious questions about the CIA's actions and their honesty.
Hmm.
Now let's move on to Oliver Stone. He's been involved with this case for a long time, and he had a lot to say about the physical evidence.
He did. He thinks the Warren Commission just didn't do a good job investigating some crucial aspects of the case, and he specifically called out the chain of custody for the rifle and the magic bullet.
The magic bullet, that's CE-399, right?
Right,
The
got it.
bullet that supposedly went through both Kennedy and Governor Connolly.
That's the one.
That's always been one of the most contested pieces of evidence. So what did Stone say about it?
Well, first, he talked about the chain of custody for the rifle. He brought up the opinion of Henry Lee, who's a pretty well-known forensic scientist.
Yeah, I know that name.
Lee said that a clear and unbroken chain of custody is absolutely essential for any piece of evidence to be admissible in court.
Makes sense. You need to know that the evidence hasn't been tampered with.
Exactly. And Stone argued that with the rifle allegedly used in the assassination, that chain of custody wasn't properly maintained. He pointed to inconsistencies in descriptions of the rifle and things like that.
So he's basically saying we can't be sure that the rifle presented as evidence was actually the one used in the assassination?
Yeah, and that's a pretty fundamental issue. And then, of course, there's the magic bullet itself. Stone highlighted how improbable its trajectory would have had to be, going through all those people and causing all those wounds, yet remaining almost completely intact.
It does seem pretty far-fetched.
And James Eugenio actually had some additional doubts about CE-399.
Oh, like what?
He was skeptical about the chain of custody for the bullet itself. He even mentioned witness testimony suggesting that the bullet initially recovered might not have been the same one that was later presented as evidence.
So not only is the trajectory questionable, but the bullet itself might not even be the right one.
Right, and all of that just adds more fuel to the fire for those who doubt the lone gunman theory.
Yeah, it definitely throws the whole thing into question. Stone also talked about some witness accounts that were left out of the Warren Commission's report. What were those about?
He mentioned 3 women who were in the book depository at the time of the shooting, and they gave accounts that contradict the idea that Oswald was the lone gunman on the 6th floor.
So where did they place Oswald?
According to Stone, they placed him downstairs at the time of the shooting, and that information was not included in the Warren Commission's final report.
That's pretty significant. If true, it would mean that a key piece of evidence contradicting the official narrative was ignored.
Exactly. And Stone went even further, calling for a true interrogation of the CIA.
What did he mean by that?
He clearly thinks there's more to uncover there. And he even quoted James Angleton, who had a very low opinion of some of his colleagues at the CIA.
What did Angleton say?
His quote was, "If you were in a room with them, you were in a room full of people that you had to believe would deservedly end up in hell."
Wow, that's a pretty damning statement.
It is. It suggests there was a lot of distrust and animosity within the CIA at the time, and that could definitely have implications for how the agency handled the investigation.
Okay, so we've got a lot of unanswered questions swirling around the CIA. Now, let's talk about James Eugenio. He focused on the issue of withheld documents and his experience with the Assassination Records Review Board, the ARB.
Right, and his argument is basically that the case is still open precisely because so many documents are still being kept secret. He specifically mentioned the Schlesinger memo.
The Schlesinger memo. That was written by Arthur Schlesinger, right?
Yeah, he was an advisor to JFK, and the memo was about reorganizing the CIA.
I remember hearing about that. JFK was supposedly trying to rein in the CIA after the Bay of Pigs fiasco.
Right, exactly. And Giannino's point is that the CIA's version of that memo is heavily redacted.
Oh, heavily.
He said they cut 60% of the original memo, and then of what remained, they redacted another 40%.
So we're only seeing a small fraction of the original document.
Exactly. And Eugenio's point is, how can we possibly have the full story when such important documents are still being kept from the public?
It makes you wonder what they're hiding.
It does. And Eugenio also talked about his experience with the ARB. He said it was a constant struggle to get information from the CIA and the FBI.
Really?
Yeah, he said they seemed to be deliberately obstructing the process, even though the law required them to release these documents. He gave some specific examples, but the overall impression he gave was that these agencies were still very invested in keeping secrets.
Decades after the assassination.
Decades after the assassination.
That's pretty remarkable. Now, Oliver Stone brought up one specific piece of evidence that he thinks could shed some new light on Oswald's whereabouts during the shooting. What was that?
He mentioned an NBC film that he believes might show Oswald downstairs in the book depository at the time of the shooting.
Really?
Yeah.
That would directly contradict the Warren Commission's findings.
Exactly. And Stone thinks that if this film exists and it shows what he thinks it shows, it would be a game changer.
So basically, even a basic fact like where Oswald was at the moment of the assassination is still open to question, and there might be evidence out there that could clarify it. Now, the experts also touched on some broader unanswered questions, ones that go beyond just Oswald.
Yeah, Eugenio mentioned the assassinations of Robert F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. He thinks all three of these cases might be connected somehow, part of a larger pattern.
That's an interesting thought.
And Morley talked about JFK's opposition to what he called the forces of militarism and racism, which suggests that there might have been powerful groups who opposed JFK's policies.
Okay, so if we step back and try to answer our big question, what have we learned and what remains in question about the JFK assassination?
Well, I think we've learned that there are still a lot of gaps in our knowledge, and that there are powerful forces that seem determined to keep those gaps from being filled.
We're still debating basic facts,
Yeah.
like where Oswald was, what the CIA knew, and even what evidence was collected.
Right. And there are still so many documents being kept secret. It's hard to feel confident that we have the full story when so much information is still hidden.
Yeah, it's a pretty unsettling feeling.
It is. And, for anyone listening who wants to understand this event, I think the real question is, what does all of this say about government transparency and accountability? If we can't get the full story about something as momentous as the assassination of a president, what does that say about our ability to hold our leaders accountable? It's a pretty heavy question.
It is, and it's a question that's still very relevant today. Thanks for breaking all this down.
It's been a fascinating, if somewhat troubling, journey through the evidence.
Yeah, and I think it's clear that this is a story that's far from over.
Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next episode on While We Were Distracted.